So welcome everyone. And I want to thank all of you here for committing your time to be here. Because if anything, time, you can never get it back. So for you to commit and be here, that's a big deal. So thank you so much for that. Now I'm gonna start off this event today by quoting one of my favorite African proverbs that really summarizes what this event is all about today. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So that's what we are all doing today. We've all come together for this International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. It is a day where we commemorate the 69 people that were killed in 1960 in South Africa, who were just basically trying to have a peaceful demonstration against the racist apartheid law that were happening at the time. The International Day to End Racism and Discrimination is always on March 21st, which happens to be today. So we targeted the right day. So here we are today, and it's every year. But it should be noted as well that addressing racism is not a one-time event. It's not a one-time exercise. It is so complex and it's ongoing. So this year, the United Nations theme for today is Youth to Stand Up Against Racism. And I really enjoy working with the youth. So for them to have that as the theme, I was blown away and I was excited by the theme for this year. And as you all know, some of you may or may not know that the hashtag is Fight Racism. So if you're right now, you're using your Twitter or whatever it is, you can use the hashtag Fight Racism. Now, racism is a vicious global pandemic, and we're all familiar with pandemic, with the COVID-19. So racism is not any different. It is a pandemic and it's everywhere, but it's something that can be solved. We're here today basically to confront the inherent of racism. Most of the racism is rooted from centuries of colonialism and oppression. We can see it in the indigenous community. We can see it in ethnic people, religion, and most recently, as you all have paid attention to the news, we've seen it in the Asian descent, with them being blamed for bringing in the COVID-19. So racism is everywhere. Now, the goal for today's event, because you can only do so much, we're a small gathering, but we got to start somewhere. So our goal today is to make racism, all of us to be more aware of racism, and what is the action that we can take from here on. As the United Nations General Secretary recently spoke at an event, he said, his name is Antonio Guterres, in case some of you may not be familiar with his name. He said, when you see racism, you must condemn it without reservation, hesitation, or qualification. And this includes all of us looking within ourselves and asking, am I a racist? Whether it's consciously or unconscious. And if you are, ask yourself, what is it I can do to overcome that? It is time to acknowledge and repair years of wrongdoing by really reconciling and also being able to have equality, because we are all equal. Nobody is better than the other. We are all equal. Before we begin this event, I also want to thank the team that made this event possible. And it goes without saying, as Guy mentioned, there's 3 organizations here that made it possible. Number 1, with no particular order. So I don't want you to say, why did you go first? There's no particular order, it's just random. The first one is the Edmonton Interfaith Centre of Education and Action, and the Canadian Multicultural Education Foundation, with the assistance from the United Nations Association in Canada. And we also had our sponsor, Diversity Magazine Plus, who also helped support this and showcased all over, so all of you can be aware that it's happening. It's always good to know if an event is happening. You go through social media or it's word of mouth. So all of you, however you manage to know about the event, thank you. And whoever told you, thank them as well. But before we continue, it is so essential and vital that we do a verbal land acknowledgement. And I'm going to do that right now. We acknowledge with thanks that we are on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional meeting grounds, gathering place, and traveling route for the Cree, Sute, Métis, Diné, and Nakota Sioux. We acknowledge all the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit whose footsteps have marked the lands for centuries. I would like to introduce our Elder Pauline Paulson. And Pauline is actually the past president of the Edmonton Interfaith Centre. We're so honored to have her here. And she is going to offer a First Nation blessing. And also, one of the things that I should say, this event is being recorded. However, during the blessing, just to be respectful of her request, we are not going to be recording this portion of the event. And thank you so much for that. You could always use a blessing. So coming from you today, we really are honored to be in your presence and having you bless us. So everyone, on behalf of everyone, we thank you. But in mind, I am going to introduce to you our very first speaker, and he's going to put everything in perspective. For some of us who may not know what this event is all about, he's going to put it in perspective. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Chaldeans Mensah. This is when we clap.
Harriet, thank you very much for that warm welcome. And I'll be remiss in not mentioning my long association with Guy Blood. We've golfed together. We've worked on the UN Association for years. So it's a pleasure to be back again, working on the same project. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to offer brief comments on the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. I commend the Edmonton Interfaith Centre and the Canadian Multicultural Education Foundation and the United Nations Association in Canada, Edmonton Branch, for commemorating this day at a time of heightened concern about racism in all its expressions. I recall with deep appreciation the efforts of Edmonton civil society, spearheaded by the Canadian Multiculturalism Education Foundation, Edmonton Interfaith Centre, and the United Nations Association, to organize a conference here in Edmonton in 1998 to mark the 50th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this event, many of you recall, brought to Edmonton Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the famous anti-apartheid campaigner, as well as the UN Commissioner for Human Rights and former President of Ireland, Mary Robinson. So this demonstrates that this collaboration effort has produced wonderful work to highlight the importance of human rights here in Edmonton. So the UN General Assembly in Resolution 2142, adopted in 26 October 1966, proclaimed 21st March as the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, to be marked annually. It called upon the international community to redouble its efforts to eliminate all forms of racial discrimination. As Harriet Tinka mentioned a few minutes ago, The day actually is commemorating the 21st March 1960 police massacre of 69 peaceful demonstrators in Sharpeville, South Africa. And this was an event that really spurred on the anti-apartheid efforts, and which the United Nations designated as a day to be commemorated to eliminate racial discrimination. In 2001, the World Conference Against Racial Discrimination was held in Durban, South Africa, and it produced a comprehensive program for combating racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerances. In 2011, the General Assembly reiterated its strong determination to make the fight against racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerances, and the prosecution of the victims a high priority. The UN-led efforts have not eliminated the problem of racism. Indeed, UN Secretary General very recently has described racism as a vicious global pandemic. And he points out that racism manifests itself in many forms, conscious and unconscious, and combating it demands actions every day and at every level. Similarly, the current UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Michelle Bachelet, former president of Chile, compared racism to the current pandemic, the COVID pandemic. And she says that racism and xenophobia are contagious killers. So it's clear that this is a serious problem that requires the effort of the international community to address and eliminate. So to prepare us for our panel discussion today, I'm going to offer two solutions. Number one, the centrality of youth in advancing anti-racism is a very important point. And I think Harriet mentioned that the theme this year is for the youth to stand up against racism. So I think the youth are very important in this struggle against racism. Youth are critical in carrying out the struggle to promote an inclusive society, a culture of human rights, and to promote a global culture of tolerance, equality, and anti-discrimination. Young people have been on the forefront of actions during the Black Lives Matter protests, anti-Asian racism, anti-Semitism, struggle against discrimination, against discrimination targeting indigenous peoples, and are quick to call out injustices on social media. Secondly, we need to situate anti-racism as a struggle for human rights, one that requires collective efforts to embrace this struggle as a fight for human dignity. This is not a partisan struggle. I want to emphasize this. This is really a key point for my, in terms of my perspective here. Anti-racism is not a partisan struggle. We can't simply excuse ourselves and say, oh, racism is just an issue for those people carrying torches down there. Racism is an issue for those people out there in some kind of political domain. It is a collective issue. We need to address it in all its forms. We need to see it as a struggle for human dignity. It is a multifaceted struggle, and to tackle it, we have to address all its expressions, its subtle forms, its microaggressions, its practices, and its ideologies. Again, the struggle is one of asserting human dignity, and it is rooted in the notion of the human family based on equality, dignity, and solidarity. It is my fervent hope that as we listen to this excellent panel that we have today, Pauline Paulson, Jody Kaluhu Stonehouse, Alvin Finkel, they are going to really address and confront the inherent racism that we all as a collective have to deal with and address. And to set us up, I hope we listen carefully to the panel, and I hope the panel challenges us to embrace this struggle for human dignity and support anti-racism efforts and collectively work for an inclusive, democratic, and equitable world. So I'm just going to end on this note, and I want to thank the Edmonton Interfaith Centre and the Canadian Multiculturalism Education Foundation, UNAC Edmonton, for organizing this important commemoration of this day that we fight collectively to eliminate the scourge of racism. Thank you very much.
And they're very distinguished. The pillars that we're going to focus on today are compassion, prejudice, and privilege, in no particular order. So our speakers will be basically touching on those. Some of them may, of course, intersect, and they might be talking about one or the other, because it's difficult sometimes to speak about one without the other, including the other three. And once each individual has spoken and highlighted the key things that they want to highlight for us today, at the end, we will have a Q&A where I will have all of you, if you have a question, please use the chat function to submit your questions to me. I may not be able to get to all of the questions. However, these questions are important, and perhaps if we need more responses, we can get the speakers to definitely forward you the solutions to your questions. So it's super exciting. I'm gonna continue with the event without mumbling on, because you're all excited about our speakers. Now, our very first speaker is Beryl Scott. Without further ado, I would love to introduce Beryl Scott, who is going to unpack her experiences on this day. Beryl, the baton is yours.
Thank you, Harriet, and thank you to everyone who's listening in. I may appear to be very extrovert, but I'm not really. I have to fight to do this. So I'll try and get through all of this to let you know who I am and where my journey started and where I'm at right now. And I'm very happy to share my journey with you. And I hope that if you have questions about it, because trying to do it all, there's not enough time to do it. So if you need more things, just send those questions in, and then we'll try and answer them for you later on. And one thing that stands out in my mind in my journey is that the motto of my country, Jamaica, is out of many, one people. And that is something that resonates with me wherever I'm at, and with everybody, because that it means that who we are, that there is every different races in Jamaica, and we're not bosom buddies, but we're all take care of each other one way or the other that goes on. And in sharing my journey with you, I'd like to talk about first my grandmother, Clementina Austin. And I talk about her because I call her Mama, and she's the person that has instilled in me the way I carry myself right now. And even though she's gone, she's still here with me. Regardless of what I'm doing, she's always around me. And the words of wisdom that she gave to me when I decided that I wanted to leave the country to go to another country, and I was very successful in getting a scholarship to go there, one of the words she said to me was that if anyone treats you badly or misbehaves to you, all you need to tell them, if they make any way of dealing with your color or your race or whatever is to say to them, come walk a mile in my shoes and then talk about it to me. And I've lived that motto, and it's something that never goes away. And when I was leaving, the day I was actually leaving, I got a hug, I got a kiss, I got those words said to me again by my grandma. And she also said to me, don't look back, keep your head forward. And that those words from her is something that I live with even now. And I think my friends that know me, and I see some of them that I are here, and the people that I work with will say, Beryl never looks back. She's always looking forward for something else to do, and she always finds it. So that's who I am. Now, the journey from leaving Jamaica took me across the Atlantic, eastbound from one island to another. And during the flight, I vacillated around, is this what I really want to do? Because our flight from Jamaica to England was diverted to Canada, in Montreal, because of the storm. And that was frightening for a young girl. And I didn't know what was going to happen, but eventually off I went to England the next day. And then my mother found out where I was. But when I got to England, I'm thinking now it's midnight. Where am I? And I happened to look, anyone who's gone through the Heathrow Airport, there used to be a revolving form that went around, and I saw my name up there. And I'm thinking, oh. So then I looked towards the other entrance and I saw somebody was standing there with my name on it. And I'm thinking, oh, somebody's here for me. I got to go find that person. And sure enough, it was from the Jamaican ambassador to Britain. There was somebody there to greet me and to make sure I was taken care of. And again, the words of my grandmother came to me, there's always going to be somebody there for you. Just reach out. And having flown the 75,000 miles to go to England, it was a long journey for me. And it was a time when I worried about myself. But then I was okay once I got some people that my mother had made arrangements that I was not going to be left out there by myself. And another thing she said to me was, you never know when I'm going to turn up there, so you better live the life that I taught you. And as old as I am now, those words are still going through me, my grandma and my mom's words. It always comes at me at times when I'm at my lowest ebb. I know I can turn to them. And the connections that I had showed up to me after I'd been in England for, I think it was a year. And I happened to have made friends from the school. And we were invited up to London, to meet with the aunt of one of the girls from Trinidad. And we got lost on the tube. Does anybody know what I mean by the tube? The underground we got lost. And so we were going around and around in a circle and not sure where we were going. And finally, we got out of one of the stations and we were standing there, and the six of us were standing together and we're thinking, what are we going to do? It's now after midnight. And then all of a sudden this voice went, Beryl Scott, what are you doing out here at this time of the night? And I turned around and I'm thinking, what's going on here? And I did not recognize that person, only to find out that in Jamaica, we call adults, even if they're only a month older than you, we call them uncles and aunties. And this is one of the uncles that I knew. His name was Mr. Bent. And he looked at me and he says, what are you doing out? And then we had to go through the whole story as getting lost in the tube. And why were you on the tube? Why weren't you back in Bournemouth? And so his wife finally said to him, you've scared them enough. Stop. Let's find out how we can get them sorted out, which they did. And those were days when we looked at, in England at that time, this is the ugly specter of racism and race relations showed its head, because those were the days of the Bubba Boys. And we were victims of racism, and violence were perpetrated by the far right groups and the National Front. And that's why he was that concerned that here we are, 6 people standing together, and we were all different nationalities, but we were all friends at this time. And he sorted it out for me. And again, I'm thinking, my grandmother and my mother is taking care of me still. Make sure this person who hasn't seen me since I was like 7 years old, he's here to take care of me. So that's one thing that I need to say, that that's part of my journey that will always stay there. And it also helps me to remember to always lend a helping hand to a stranger that may be looking lost. I still do that now. So that's where we go. Now, went into nursing, and school was the easiest part of it, because it was a matter of getting to know people and showing respect for them and asking them for respect without saying it. And that was good. But now I go into where I decided to join the ranks of nursing, which was what I really wanted to do. And the schooling in England is a bit different than it is here. So you didn't spend all your time in the classroom. You spent probably, after the first 6 months, you had 1 month where you would go in for 5 hours in the evening, or to get used to working around patients. And one thing that showed me what racism was all about was, I was at this time coming up to my 18th birthday, and I was in a unit, which was a male/female orthopedic unit. And my patient that evening was a young man who decided to use derogatory names to me of what he wanted. And without thinking, I got so angry, I forgot what my grandmother had said to me or what my mom had said to me, and I did tell him off. But I told him off in patois. And patois is broken French, broken English, and you leave a couple T's off, you leave a couple K's off, but they soon get the message what you're talking about. And there was one gentleman that was at the other side of the room where this young man was, and heard what he'd said to me. As I walked past, the tears were streaming down my face. I remember him asking me to dry my eyes, and he said, come to me. And I did go to him, and he said, honey, I work here at the wharfs in London, and I've worked with Jamaicans, Trinidadians, Barbadians, Africans, and I do know patois. So I do know what you just said. And I'm going to say to you, I'm sorry you had to go through that. I will take care of it, but don't ever say it again. And I walked away, and I'm not going to tell you what I said, but I was very rude. And I walked away, and I came out, and I went to my preceptor, and I told her I did not want to work on that side of the unit again. And she said, Beryl, I'm sorry, you will have to. This is what you put yourself in. You're going to learn how to deal with it, and we'll do it together. And I'm thinking, how are you going to be a Scottish girl telling me how to put up with somebody being racist to me? How are you going to do it? I want to see it. But anyway, the next day I came in, she would not take me off that side of the unit. She put me back there. And the young man was there still because he was going to be there for more than 3 months because of his injury. And I noticed he had his head down when I came there, but my preceptor was with me. And the gentleman who had told me he would take care of it, he had a walking stick and he knocked the window to say to the young man, get with it. And he did apologize to me, but I'm going to say to you, this is the one time I did not accept his apology because I felt it was not heartfelt. He was threatened by this other patient. And so he just said it to get me off his back, I guess. But, you know, it taught me a few lessons that exactly what my grandma was saying to me, I should have said, but I didn't. And it made me go back and think about everything that I'm doing. And when I think about staying in England, by that time I had been lucky in that I got through my education, and because I was leaving before repaying back to the hospital the fact that they paid for everything. They paid for my wages. They paid me for my meals and stuff. I decided I am going to be trying somewhere else. And as Harriet said, I came on a holiday with my sister and her family in Hamilton. And then I went back to England after 6 weeks. And I became uncomfortable. I wanted to be with my family. So off I came, but I digressed a little bit. I lost my grandmother. And it was the hardest thing to deal with because she was my mother. She was my grandmother. She was everything to me, and I lost her. So going back to Jamaica was hard, and going back to England was hard. So I then had to wrap it up for myself by saying, I'm going to be doing this, this, and this to continue my journey. So I did finally come back to Canada, and I went to Hamilton. And then my brother, who was living in Hamilton, his company transferred him to Edmonton. But then he and I were on the phone every night. And I think there's one of our board members who's here, Karen, can tell you that I have a sister that I talk to her 2-3 times a day. And that's the way it was with my brother and I and his family. And then finally he said to me, my phone bills are getting too high, sis. Get out here. So I ended up here in Edmonton and ended up in Hamilton. In Edmonton, it was, again, I worked at the Royal Alec for a year, and then I hated 8-hour shifts. I wanted the 12 hours. So Edmonton General was hiring in obstetrics for 12-hour nurses. So off I did. I phoned in, I got an interview, and I transferred to the Edmonton General Hospital. And guess what happened? The night before I started on the unit, there was a strike. So here I am, not knowing anybody, excepting for one person who I had met coming from Hamilton to Edmonton. I met her and her husband. They said, and my brother said, you're not going to work. You're going to continue doing what you're doing to make sure that life is better for patients. And so it is. I was on a picket line in minus 30 degrees, and I'm cold and I'm shivering, but I did it. And that's when I decided that I needed to stand up for everybody, because there were some very, I call them disgusting people around, that when they saw a Black face, they had to come out and be as nasty as they can be. But I had learned a lesson not to let them get to me. And all I remember is Randy saying to me once, Beryl, if they offer you a cup of coffee because you're cold, do not accept it. And I'm glad I did not accept it because of what went on. When I think of what is happening right now to the place, I don't want to mention the name because it hurts me to mention that country and what is going on there, and to see what is happening to the Asians, and it's already happening to the Black lives. I've seen all the people that have been killed, seen all the people that have been treated poorly, and children being locked in these stupid wire fences. And it gets me worried that I need to fight some more, because racism is rampant, racism is there, and it's sometimes even within the groups that you belong to, that you don't know it, but it's there. And for me, I just need to say that I find it hard when I see the physical things that people can do to each other. And I've met that in nursing as I worked here in Edmonton. It's not something I enjoy talking about, because every time I do it, it brings back episodes of stuff that is very hurtful, and I don't really want to go near it for a bit. And I acknowledge that I had privilege in some things, because one, I was given the opportunity to leave my island. Yes, it was very colonial, and I was able to see another way of life and to see what is right and what is wrong. I will continue, and I make that promise to myself every day, I will continue to work to try and make things better for everyone. I will continue to, there's a verbal aggression that happens a lot, and that I've learned to not smile at, but able to stand my ground, and I will speak to people about it. And I will say, stop, enough. And the uneasy feeling that I have at times around certain people and around certain things, I have to either walk away and think and then come back with a different opinion. But I think people will say to me, as I have heard a lot of times, say to me, oh, I'm not racist. I've got tons of Black friends. I work with them. But guess what? When you tell me that, that's when I run a mile, because you're the person that I'm afraid of. The person who tells me I have Black friends. You don't have Black friends, you have a friend. And that's how I view it. And if that's wrong, I'm not going to change my mind. But if you keep telling me I have Black friends, so you know I'm not racist, Beryl. Well, guess what? You are racist. And I will point it out and I will say it to them. So I also look at people's faces when I talk to them sometimes. And they start talking about, oh, I like your braids. Oh, I do this, or I do that. And I'll go, don't put your hand in my hair, please. I don't like it. And I will say, it's nice to meet you. And I'll move on. Because if I stay, I think I'm hurting myself, because I don't think that person is thinking what he or she is saying. And I've lost 2 friends because one of my motto is, don't tell me I have Black friends. I don't want to hear it. Tell me of your friend, Beryl. Tell me of your friend, Judy. Tell me of your friend, Karen. Don't tell me of what you think of. Just don't put that little qualifier there. I don't want it. So I would like to say that I hope I have opened up your minds about what I think for me is a journey. And thank you for having me.
Thank you, Beryl, so much for sharing that. Your story is very emotional, and I can tell as you're speaking, it still has an impact on you. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Finkel as he unpacks the pillar of being compassionate. Dr. Finkel, the baton is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Harriet. And thanks to the organizers for inviting me to be part of this wonderful day. So my topic is the importance of compassion in promoting multiculturalism. And I argue, though many would not necessarily want this kind of emphasis, that promoting cross-cultural understanding is unfortunately a non-start when the wealth gap is constantly growing. In other words, when inequality is what marks the whole society. In those circumstances, inevitably a certain element of the white Christian majority, or whatever the majority will be in a group, chooses to blame particular ethnic groups, or all immigrants, or indigenous peoples, or foreign countries for their sense of economic insecurity and falling status. Now, of course, it's irrational, but in historical terms, it's wholly predictable. So who are these haters in Western countries with prejudices strong enough to physically attack or threaten minority group members or their facilities? A British study outlines factors that produce racial offenders. These include, quote, entrenched local racism, local social and economic deprivation, passive engagement in leisure activities, few affordable youth facilities, high levels of adult criminality, linked with wider criminal networks and violent youth subculture, unquote. In short, economic considerations loom large in creating virulent racism. That doesn't mean that all well-off members of majority groups are non-racist, or that all poor ones are racist, but for the same reasons that the disadvantaged are more likely to commit crimes, become drug addicts, or to prove unable to follow health and dietary guidelines, they're more likely to be involved in racist activities. They're people marginalized in a hierarchical society, and many try to raise their status by clinging to whatever status indicators might provide them a sense of superiority over others: color, nominal religion, place of birth, things that really shouldn't be important. Instead of rebelling against the hierarchy and the deprivations that have humiliated them, they accept hierarchical notions but rebel against pure marketplace created hierarchies to improve their dismal economic prospects by defining others to be the rightful social losers. So reducing inequalities in society is not just compassion, though it is certainly compassion, but also a way to reduce racism. When I speak of equality, I mean equality of condition, not total equality of condition necessarily, but a lot of it, not just equality of opportunity. The two are often presented as the opposed goals of socialism versus liberalism. In the real world, though, they're often one. American political scientist John Harles, in a recent book called Seeking Equality, the Political Economy of the Common Good of the United States and Canada, provides statistics that demonstrate that social mobility has vanished in the United States. He says, if you live in the United States, choose your parents well, because you're not going anywhere if you're born into a poor family. Now, encouragingly, there is still social mobility in Canada, and to a larger degree than in the US, but it's disappearing more and more. And the reason that it's a little better here than in the US is because inequalities of incomes in Canada are not quite as severe as in the US. When the starting points in life are distant, equality of opportunity is unfortunately a lie for most people. In the spirit level, why more equal societies almost always do better. British epidemiologists Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett compare crime rates, reported mental health issues, obesity, and reported happiness of individuals across OECD countries and across American states. Their research demonstrates that desirable social outcomes coincide with a degree of statistical equality in nations and even in American states. Indeed, while this is an interesting one, while the social statistics, this is no surprise in the first half, social statistics for the wealthiest 20% of Americans are leagues ahead of those for the poorest 20% of Americans. By contrast, you look at the social statistics for the bottom 20% of Norwegians. They're way better than the top 20% of Americans. So what happens when wealth gaps become extreme and massive unemployment results from a capitalist recession if the state responds is austerity? The simple answer is fascism. including Nazism. The toxic National Socialist Party in Germany won only about 2% of the vote in national elections during the 1920s, while with Adolf Hitler's and his hateful rhetoric against Jews, Roma, gays, and non-whites, among others. The dominant party in the country in that period was the urban trade union dominated Social Democrats, and they led efforts to expand the welfare state that seemed to placate most Germans, regardless of what prejudices they might hold against minority groups. I mean, it didn't get rid of prejudices, obviously, but it at least didn't make them, the dominant thing in people's lives. But the conservative-minded parties in Germany responded to the beginning of the Great Depression by insisting on austerity. They combined to throw the Social Democrats right out of the government, and they slashed unemployment insurance, slashed job creation programs, slashed social assistance of every kind. The resulting unemployment and desperation drove millions, especially uneducated people in the countryside, but also many small business people and marginal non-unionized workers into the arms of the Nazis and their party, which was generally funded by big business. The non-Nazi conservative parties had a choice at that point of working with the socialists and communists, who actually had a bigger vote between them than the Nazis had, or joining with the Nazis to create a parliamentary majority. They chose the latter and created the possibility for the Nazis to suppress all other parties and prepare the country for a war that led to 80 million deaths and the Holocaust against the Jews. Now, supporters of an unfettered capitalism often argue that that provides the people the most liberty possible. Well, what kind of freedom? When freedom is just another word for nothing left to lose. There I'm stealing from Janis Joplin, just like as Harriet said, I stole from Tina Turner. It's irrational to think that the losers are not going to react in some collective manner. Now that reaction might be a peaceful parliamentary social democracy, implementing a cradle to grave set of social guarantees. That's what happened in Scandinavia during the Depression. It was fairly urbanized, and the voters of a feudalized, uneducated peasantry were not as important as they were in Germany. Or it could be a communist revolution, as it was in Russia in 1917, where the total intransigence of the ruling classes made it possible for a small, disciplined, and ultimately rather authoritarian party to seize power with the support of at least the urban masses and the conscripted soldiers. But a fascist solution, in which there is an alliance of big business, the aristocracy, and plebeian, but pro-capitalist ultra-racists who consider themselves patriots, is equally plausible, as Italy showed in the 1920s and Germany, Spain, and Portugal in the 1930s. Well, what examples in the real world suggest that compassionate governments makes any difference in diluting or eliminating racism? Here are several. The first couple come from Canada. One is Newfoundland. In Ireland, Catholics and Protestants had long demonized one another. Divisions began in the 1100s when England invaded and took control of much of Ireland. In 1603, they took complete control, and the native Irish were pushed onto the most marginal lands. The conquerors were English and Scottish Protestants, while the native Irish remained Catholics, refusing to convert to the conqueror's religion. The invaders, having pushed the native Irish to the margins, then rationalized their actions by saying, oh, the Irish, they're all lazy, they're uneducated, they're drunk, and they're poor because they're drunk and they're idle. But that's always what the colonizers say. They always say the poverty is the result of people's personal attributes, as opposed to their having been dispossessed. In 19th century Newfoundland, about half the settlers were Irish, and they were evenly divided between Catholics and Protestants, and they did bring with them their prejudice from the old country. Well, in the 1850s, the leaders of the Catholic and Protestant communities decided they needed some kind of a compromise to reduce religious tensions. So the first thing they decided was, well, the Newfoundland government would fund Catholic and Protestant schools equally per student, and that the government jobs, this is very important, government jobs would be divided amongst Catholics and Protestants proportionate to their numbers in the colony. And it was a wise decision, because through the period of the Troubles in Northern Ireland from the 60s to the 90s, Catholics complained that all government jobs were reserved for Protestants. And Protestants defended such job reservation, saying, well, we're the ones who are loyal to Britain. The Catholics are just loyal to the Pope. Well, and the Newfoundland accommodation held and was extended to the field of social welfare. Social welfare wasn't generous in Newfoundland before it was part of Canada, but it was different from in Canadian provinces. In Canadian provinces, there was assessment of whether people were worthy of aid. were they morally worthy? Newfoundland decided, we're not going to do that because it's going to start with this whole Catholic Protestant thing again. They just said, if you can show that you need some money to just get by, we provide it. We don't ask questions how you got there. So long before colonial Newfoundlanders decided how to live harmoniously, the Indigenous peoples of Canada carved their own path to harmony. Cree elder Danny Musquat, speaking of his nation's traditions before European settlement, writes, quote, "We had agreements between one another, hunting territories that we shared, gathering lands that we shared, medicinal lands that we shared, peace territorial lands that we designated for the shelter and safety for all people. Such agreements extended to trading partners, so that reciprocal economic arrangements led to good neighbor policies, cemented in ceremonies promising peace and sharing among Indigenous peoples with different cultures." Now, the Indian state of Kerala provides another positive example. As many of you know, India's current national government, the BJP, is a Hindu nationalist party that's largely intolerant of other religions, and it supports the caste differences amongst Hindus. But the BJP holds one seat out of 141 in the Kerala state legislature. Kerala is majority Hindu, though less so than India as a whole, but still majority Hindu. In public life, a live and let live philosophy reigns that has made the BJP irrelevant. Why? As early as 1956, in their first state elections, Kerala's elected a self-styled communist government. For much of the period since that time, left front majorities have governed. Their reformist legislation is generally not repealed when the opposing, somewhat more conservative grouping of parties take office. There is a society-wide agreement that government should tax the wealthy and corporations heavily and provide a Scandinavian-style welfare state. The distribution of wealth, once government programs are factored in, is the most equal in India. The result? Well, life expectancy is 7 years greater than the Indian average. They have the lowest infant mortality in India, the highest literacy rates, and significant gender equality. Femicide, the aborting or killing of baby girls, an epidemic in much of rural India and China, where girls are seen as requiring dowries and then looking after their husband's parents in old age, is unknown in Kerala. In Kerala, the state looks after all who need help in old age or earlier. It's free schooling, plentiful and free medical care, ambitious housing projects, government-operated ration shops and supermarkets, women-led government-funded community development schemes, on and on. The point being, all of this seems to do a good job, amongst other things, of causing Keralans to accept multiculturalism. World War II could have been avoided if all countries had responded to the Depression in the manner of the Scandinavian countries, and to a degree, the United States under FDR. That was recognized in the post-war years, with 3 decades of expanding social programs and programs intended to avoid unemployment. Much of that was intended to stave off industrial unrest and election of left-wing governments. But an elite-led rebellion in the 1980s led to rollbacks of these achievements. Unemployment, poverty, and income gaps rose remarkably. In the US, despite a 70% increase in overall productivity from 1980 to 2015, half of American households saw no increase in after-tax income. Of course, that increased tribalism and racism has also happened across both Eastern and Western Europe, and to a degree, Canada. In conclusion, when we fight for human rights, we must also fight for compassionate social programs that reduce the numbers of people who, from a combination of desperation and opportunism, try to steal a march on others, whom they hope can be deemed to be unlike them. Much as some might want both an ultra-competitive society and a non-racist society, it's unfortunately as irrational as racism itself. Just as big corporations have manipulated markets and nations for their own advantage, it's not really a surprise that many people in so-called charter groups also try to manipulate reality to benefit themselves. So, when we fight for such programs as guaranteed decent housing for all, guaranteed livable annual incomes, high minimum wages, government job creation programs, universal pharmacare, universal dental care, universal daycare, fully public long-term care and home care, we are not only fighting for a compassionate Canada, but a Canada with the preconditions for multiculturalism. Thank you. Excellent question, Meenal. Yes, I think there are lots of similarities. to what happened right after the First World War, I think we're in a better position than at that time, because right after the First World War, what happened is that, I mean, during the First World War, I mean, it was a terrible event, and it was, basically just rival imperialisms. And any attempt to say that the First World War had good guys or bad guys is completely wrong. But, so after the slaughter is over, this pandemic comes along, which kills even more people than the war did. The response at the time, though, was for governments to try and get rid of the state functions that had occurred during the war. I mean, during the war, almost everybody was working, because either they were soldiers or they were civilians, making munitions. Then after the war, they weren't needed, and there's massive unemployment. There were strikes like the Winnipeg General Strike and the ECHO strikes across this country that showed that many people wanted a different kind of society, wanted something that was more social democratic or even communist. But overall, the society was rural, it was anti-government, and so you had a long recession at the beginning of the 1920s. I mean, the roaring, people talk about the roaring 20s. It didn't start till 1924. Between 1919 and 1924, you've got massive unemployment and that huge increases in productivity, but nobody's sharing in it. So then you get a brief good period from 24 to 29, and then the capitalist cycle goes boom, from boom to bust again, and you get this terrible reaction of governments that, oh, well, what we need to do is cut even more so that the private sector will, come in and save us all. Well, what happened, as they only tended to realize after the event, was in fact the private sector doesn't move in to save anybody, because nobody wants to be the first to go in there and spend. If governments don't go in there and do it, then it won't happen. And so I think in this pandemic, we have the good luck, in a way, that the period from 45 to 75 happened, where the notion that collectively through the state we owe each other certain kinds of programming did occur. It didn't go far enough. That's what this pandemic is showing. I mean, the slaughter that's went on in the long-term care homes is a real condemnation of our whole society. What was going on in the meatpacking plants, or in terms of the workers who work in the long-term care and in the hospitals, demonstrated too this racialized workforce, where the people who are least protected happen to have non-white skin. So I think that there's been a general acceptance that we need to go in a more compassionate direction. Will that actually occur? We don't know, but I think the struggles for that are sharper now than they were before the pandemic. I think we even see that in the United States. The fact that Trump was dumped, I think speaks to the fact that for lots of people, what they bought in 2016 with this notion that, if America would just close, its walls against the world and, stop bringing in non-white people, that everything was going to be hunky-dory, for at least the white people in America. That a lot of people moved against that and said, no, actually, this whole notion that, we should be fighting each other, and that, the government has no real role in the economy, and all you do is cut corporate taxes. I think a lot of people reacted against that. Surveys in many countries are showing that people want, more collectivity, want more compassion. So I have hope, but I'm a historian, I'm not a futurologist, and I know that there's been hope in the past that was blunted in various ways. So.
that's a great response. I was just wondering if Dr. Mensah would like to also add to that. I know it was directed to Dr. Alvin. Did you want to add to that?
Of course he does.
I think Alvin is correctly linking the whole issue of social policy and its connection with racism. There's a genuine debate out there in terms of the impact of neoliberal policies versus Keynesian type policies, and maybe that impact on how it affects attitude towards marginalized and racialized individuals. I want us to carry the discussion further because I think racism is a very complex problem, and you're going to find in societies, even in societies that are very egalitarian, racism exists, so the conversation has to be very broad. And I think Beryl's message today touches on attitudes. Attitudes are individual. We need to address racism within ourselves. How do we react to other people? And what can, do we simply hive off racism concerns and say, well, it's somebody else's problem? And I think that is the problem. We need to begin the conversation with ourselves. And if we do, I think we'll go a long way. But clearly, there are other policy aspects we need to work towards, whether it's exclusion in workplaces, exclusion, as somebody mentioned, the university context, the issues that we want to work to improve. Police brutality, these issues persist. I think there needs to be drastic changes. So yes, the compassion argument is very strong, but we need to go beyond that. We need to tackle the attitudinal changes, the policy changes, and some of the structural changes we also have to embrace, because this is a very difficult problem that the global community has to address.
Addressing. By simply saying, like if you're in a department at a university or in any other organization, when you there are hirings, that you insist that it should be a goal of the organization to create a university or whatever the other institution is that reflects the overall society. And if you have very few people who are non-white, if you have no Aboriginal people, then you have to change it. That you have to have affirmative action in the hiring, and that actually will make your institution more representative of the broader society. So I think that's the starting place. The second thing is you have to try and look at the environment to see, are you set up in such a way that people who aren't part of this dominant majority will succeed, or have you failed to provide those kinds of things? Like, how will an Indigenous person feel? Are there is there some establishment of a place like where they can do their ceremonies in the building you're in? These kinds of questions. So I think it's the attempt to have a cultural representation, first of all, just in terms of bodies, in terms of reflecting the overall society, and secondly, trying to have cultural representation in terms of how your institution is set up to welcome different kinds of people.
Excellent. That's great. Oh, Beryl, you were gonna say something?
Yes, I'd really like to talk about the cultural aspect of it. I know when I got involved more in the community here in Alberta, it took myself and Judy, who's hosting me here today, we had to fight to get even our organization that had basically said that they were here to take care of everybody, regardless of color, race, and everything else. But it took us almost 3 years to get it through. And we had to get a hold of other people from within the community and within our workplaces to realize that we weren't asking for something for ourselves. We were asking for having the wherewithal that people would understand what it is we're asking for our Indigenous people. First of all, they told me I wasn't Indigenous, so I can't speak for them. And I said, well, I happen to be Indigenous, I'm a Maroon. And they go, what's a Maroon? I said, well, those are the original inhabitants of Jamaica. I said, so I think I have a right as an Indigenous person. I may not be Indian, and I may be the Maroon, which is of African descent, but I can still speak for everyone. I can speak for the white person. I can speak for everybody. It doesn't matter what your color is or your race is, I can still speak out. But it took us 3 years, Judy? Almost 4 years before we're able to now see that the people that we worked with in the community have taken on what we started and they've moved forward with it. And to begin with, we were lucky if we had 2 people come out to a meeting, and now I go back and I help the present person who's running this organization, and she'll say to me, thank you. And I said, so what? She said, well, you stood out there and fought for us, and we got it done. So it's a matter of, I think, needing to co-opt other people, not just people of your own race, but other races, co-opt them in saying, whatever happens to us could happen to you tomorrow. So we need to work together. And that's how we got it done. We were very long days, very long nights, but I was up for it, and I'm still up for it, and I'm still doing it. So I think we need to say that we need to co-opt other people in, and Mensah, I think you're right. I tried to say to you, we need to look at ourselves first, check ourselves as well as to what we think of ourselves. And I think what I'll do is I'll ask this be put out, and that's a website that you can look at implicit bias, that people could read it and see where they fall into that road, because I know there is a couple places that are hiring and they deliberately will say, I only want people from this race because they'll do what we tell them. We don't want people from quote unquote Jamaica and Trinidad and Barbados because they're warriors. They're not going to back down when they take on things. So I think we can probably, Judy, we could send this out. So
I'll put it in chat.
Yeah, I'm going to put it in chat, that website. And thank you, Sanjeev, for pointing that out to me. And I will get it out there so people can see it. But I think we need to, one way of doing it is employers are very good at moving people around so that they don't have chance to get to know each other. And then they have an easier life with a certain quote unquote race that they will not fight back. But I wish to tell them right now, everybody will fight back. They've seen what's happening down south there, and they're going to fight back now here in Edmonton.
Yeah, thank you, Beryl. I know the question that was asked earlier was also directed, somebody was asking about the university experience, what they can do on a go forward base. So I know that Dr. Mensah is at the Grant MacEwan. If you can just give us an experience for yourself, what sort of protocol do you have so that when people come in or whoever wants to apply for a position, that it's exclusive, that anybody can apply without even worrying that, oh, I'm this color and that color, and I will not get the position based on that. So that it's, and Dr. Finkel did say some of the things that a person could do. So he identified 3 things. So for Grant MacEwan, what is the experience there? How do I know if I apply for the job, I have the same opportunity as somebody else with a different culture, with a different color? What are the protocols that you have at Grant MacEwan?
Well, thank you, Harriet. Can I, if you allow me, just to broaden this question a bit and talk about some of the institutional practices at universities. Before I touch on the particularly you asked, I think universities as a whole need to create a culture that is welcoming of others. In other words, especially I just want to mention, many of our universities attract foreign students from other countries, right? And what is the way we welcome them? Well, we welcome them with high fees. They pay twice as much as a local participant. So in actual fact, it's not a welcoming context that we offer these students. We're tapping them for funds to run our universities, and that really compromises that culture of treatment with human dignity, right? So I think we need to question broadly some of these institutional policies, which unwittingly could be creating divisions in our institutions where international students have a difficult time adjusting to their economic circumstances. On hiring, I do recall years ago when I was at the University of Alberta, this is years ago, and they would hire a woman, and all hell will break loose at the university. People, professors complaining that, that they were not qualified. I think we've made tremendous progress on this front, all universities. Here at MacEwan University, it's been like a night and day. There's a concerted effort for an inclusive hiring process where issues like implicit bias, things that traditionally have been used to winnow out candidates, I think we are much more conscious now. And as I look around our faculty, it's really inclusive, includes people of different backgrounds, So I think the policies in our hiring processes are beginning to work. But just to conclude, I think universities have to create a culture where we treat people with dignity, and no, we don't see people as simply instruments to be exploited. Especially, I'm thinking about the students that are coming from overseas and coming to a different cultural context here in Canada.
Of course, one of the problems for Kerala having an influence on other parts of India is that it's in the south of the country, and the north often sees the south as like another country. They actually speak a different language than most of the people that speak that language called Malayalam. But also, what happened in Kerala was that in the period of British colonialism, the areas that later became Kerala were not under direct British control. They were tributaries in a sense. I mean, they still had their old rulers who in turn then had to collect taxes that they paid to the British for the right to sort of be semi-independent. Those rulers actually, though, unlike a lot of the others in that same position, felt particularly vulnerable to British takeover because the British wanted that area. And so they figured we need to create a popular base for ourselves. So they willingly carried out some land reforms so as to create some kind of a connection between themselves and the people, so that Britain would feel, if we go in there, there'll be a popular revolt, if we try and make that a direct British colony. The result of that was as well that then as a bit of industrialization occurred to people who came from that kind of background, were not all that worried about the people who were one cut above them in the hierarchy, including industrialists. They formed quite militant trade unions. And, so I think the attitude that developed was different in Kerala. Now that isn't saying that other states in India can't follow that model. I get the impression, traveling in India, that most people are aware, because you mentioned Kerala, they say, oh yeah, in Kerala, they have 100% literacy. In our state, it's 40%. Now, why they choose not to go in that direction, I I don't know enough about Indian society, like why the caste system and, and then this dislike of anybody who's not a Hindu is so prominent and, infects the masses in many ways. My guess is though that, maybe through popular movements like the movement of the farmers against what the BJP is doing, that some of this kind of stuff will start to collapse as people start to see some common interest in the way they did in Kerala.
Excellent. That's and anybody else wanted to add to that?
I'm not an expert on India, but
Yeah.
I think I would like to refer to the UN concerns around racism. They always link it to other intolerances. And I think in the context of India, the issues around caste system, the injustices of the caste system, the way the BJP is dealing with Muslim minorities, and issues around government responses to political protests. So there, if you look at the human rights dimension of Indian society, I think there's still some work to be done, even though India has a reputation of being a democratic state, there's still some work to be done on these other intolerances. Go ahead.
Oh, sure. I can start. Well, there are people who want to deny systemic racism because they don't want to change anything. That's the simple reality of it. I think I first really learned that racism was not just individual, it was systemic. When I was 15, I was working for the Credit Clearing Bureau of Greater Winnipeg. And I got the job because it's sort of like a scholarship thing. And the boss, the top boss at the event where I got this award, started speaking to me in Latin. And first I thought, well, the guy's nuts. And then I realized, oh, we took that in school yesterday. I gave the next two lines and I suddenly had this pretty fancy job through the rest of high school. But anyway, his son-in-law was running the show. One day I was a credit reporter. So I get a call to do a credit report on somebody. I give what's in the guy's file. And then the credit person from Simpson Sears says to me, "Is that all?" "Yes," I said. She said, "Well, add to the file that he's Black." "Oh," I said, "Well, actually that is in the file." "Why didn't you tell me that?" "Well, because what's the point? What does that matter?" "Well, I'm not prejudiced, but, Black people have a harder time finding jobs in this society than white people." I said, "Well, I told you he's had the same employer for the last 10 years. And like, what is this?" Anyway, she complained to the manager. And suddenly, screaming, this manager screaming across the office to me, "Finkel, if a file says that a guy is blah, 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 and that's what you read." And I realized, there were all this racist stuff in our files. There wasn't even human rights legislation at that time. This was 1964. And I felt terrible because, I needed that job. That was how I was going to get to university, was through this job. But I had to agree, at least, on the surface, that I was going to read racist garbage, or to people if it was in a file. What difference did it make what somebody's color was? But that's the system. And so now a lot of people, they think, well, that's okay. I'm not Black, I'm not Indigenous. What do I care if a file says that, this is another dirty Indian or whatever? I'll read it. I wasn't going to read it, but I wasn't actually, I didn't feel I could protest because I needed the job. So I think people like Rex Murphy, they're the kind who would say, "Oh yeah, I have this privilege, and that's a good thing. And why are these other people whining?" So I think that's the problem with them. And I'm proud that our Prime Minister is willing to say publicly, that these are a problem. These are problems. You can't solve a problem if you won't admit it.
Can I? Let me just take a different tack on this. Just to be a bit controversial, and my comments are not political, but here is the point. I just have problems with politicians who always speak the language that are intended to please us. They will say whatever they have to say, but when they have the power to make change, we don't see that expressed. Why hasn't Trudeau done a lot to help address indigenous drinking water problems? Why hasn't he done a lot to address some of the things that he talks about? So I want politicians to act rather than simply say the language to please, Sure, Trudeau speaks very nicely about these issues. He put it in a nice context of colonialism. Yes, but now he has the power and I want to see more. I think that is what I'm demanding of our politicians. It's not simply to speak the language and the symbolism, but produce results when you have the power to do so. So that's my take on this.
I would also like each one of our speakers, maybe in 2 or 3 sentences, to just leave us some takeaways. Because the theme was really awareness, as well as what is the action that we should be taking from now to go forward. So maybe if you can just take a few minutes to just give us some takeaways that our audience can say, okay, I was at this event. This is what I learned. I'm aware of this. This is the action me as a person can do now. Because even though we may feel like we are small, we can make big impact. So whoever wants to go first.
Okay, I think I will. I think we've just put in chat a website that people can look at to do a check of themselves and biases. Check it and see whether they need to look at their biases and see where you fall in it. And I just want people to remember, just because somebody might not have the same skin tone as you, they are people, they bleed red. They don't bleed black. They don't bleed yellow. They don't bleed whatever. And that we need to be respectful of each other. And if we can't say something nice, then don't say it.
Excellent. That is, we're all equal. Nobody's better than the other. So that is the theme. And I know I was watching one of the United Nations speeches and conferences, and that was the biggest theme, is like we're all equal. Nobody's different. So let's treat each other accordingly. So thank you, Beryl, for that. And now if we can have Dr. Mensah as well add and just give us some takeaways for our audience.
I think the takeaway is that this is being organized by the Edmonton Interfaith. Interfaith means bringing different religions together around a common purpose. And I think that should be the model for dealing with racism. Racism requires our common human approach to fight for human dignity. It is not a political game. It should not be a partisan game where people use it to win power and then fail to deliver. I think we should all aspire to work within ourselves to make the world a better place, which means treating people with respect and working with our neighbors to call out egregious cases where human rights and lack of respect is exhibited. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Mensah. And now we have Dr. Finkel as well, share his takeaways with our audience.
Well, I think the point is that we need to be fighting racism at an individual level, an institutional level, and at a social/political level. All of it. You can't really separate them because, changing certain stuff at the top, the political level won't necessarily change things at the bottom, but similarly, just changing things at the bottom won't necessarily have an impact at the top. So we have to see it as a multifaceted problem that we simply have to be dealing with all the time. I mean, I see it with in terms of my kids, the kinds of racism that they've experienced, and even my grandson, he's only 7, and when he was in kindergarten, some kid in his class, kept bugging him because his skin is somewhat black.
That's unfortunate. It's we even see it in the royal family. Recent, we had some interview go on with, so it's nobody is spared from that, unfortunately. We've become multi-ethnic, we've become multi-religion, multicultural. So we need to continue working together and being aware of our own conscious and subconscious thoughts. So we really, that's so important. So I said it off earlier saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So it's great that we all came together. And I want to thank everybody here who did put this whole event together. A huge thank you to there's a behind the scene team that really put this together. And they probably don't want me to mention their name, but I will do it anyway. It was Karen, Netta, Vivian, Sanjeev, and Kathy. And hopefully I didn't forget anybody. If I did, I'm asking for forgiveness already. Also to our Zoom master, of course, who we didn't have any technical problems. Oh my goodness, that is outstanding. And of course, I want to thank our speakers, Dr. Mensah, Beryl Scott. And I would also want to thank Jody, even though she wasn't here. She was here in spirit. I do want to thank her as well. And Dr. Finkel, hopefully I said your name. If I said it twice, that's awesome. And also a special thank you to you, our audience, because without you, this event would not be, it would be just a monologue, not a dialogue. So thank you to each and every one of you for being here. And hopefully you have lots of takeaways on being aware of racism and what you can do on an action piece as well. And we hope that the tools that you had from our speakers and the questions that were answered will make a difference in your community. And remind yourself that we're all born equal. Stand fierce against hatred. Let's all work together so that we can live in a world of opportunity and peace. And Dr. Mensah said that we really should focus on the two outcomes he mentioned earlier, which is centralized on the youth. And the theme is about the youth. Let's support our youth so we can have a vision where racism is no longer a subject. The only race that we speak about is the human race. That is important. And also, let's focus on the struggle of human rights and make it a positive conversation. So when we all get together, we don't see color, we just see a human, and treat each other with compassion, even though some people may be privileged or some people may have gone through any sort of prejudice. Let's all work with compassion. And I know it was mentioned earlier, compassion is not enough. It has to be a package. We have to change our mindset. We have to change how we view things. This is not the end of the conversation. This whole conversation is ongoing. It's going to keep on going. It's a work in progress. The racism is solvable. It's complex, but it's solvable. So let's continue to work together, love each other unconditionally, be compassionate, focus on your integrity, be good even when other people are not watching you, because that's when it really, really counts. And I want to thank everybody one more time. And thank you for having me as your host and moderator. I enjoyed this experience. And I hope that we all continue to be positive. March 21st, International Day for remembering those 69 people that were killed. So let's make it count. So back to our Zoom master.
Well, thank you very much, Harriet. And one of the things that came clear to me was the first place that I must look at and search for and confront racism is with myself.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Starts with you. Yeah. And then from there, it keep on going. It's reciprocated. Thank you, everyone.